Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams with the Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Daniel, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Paul.
Well, good. Want to talk a little bit today about a Pew survey that they've done, and they were testing the strength, I guess, of NATO, how anxious the people in Europe might be to go to war against Russia if Russia got into an actual fight with one of their neighbors. And there are some surprising results to this survey. Of course, one disappointing thing was that more than the majority of the American people and the Canadian people themselves were for it, for getting engaged and sending troops and all that. But that's not the case in Europe. That was a little bit of a surprise to me.
It was. In every single European NATO member country, even in Poland, which you hear is feels the most threatened, the population by majority does not favor going to war with Russia, even if Russia is actively attacking a NATO member. And interestingly, in the U.S., I think those numbers would be a lot closer if they weren't skewed by 69% of Republicans being in favor. I think it was much lower than a majority in the Democratic Party. So it's
one other thing that was of interest in this polling is if you looked at the age groups. It's something that I've sort of worked with because I've had favorable relations with a younger audience, and they're generally anti-war and pro-civil liberties and pro-peace, and yet the elderly are more for more anxious to go to war, willing to go to war, and I think that came out in this survey.
It did. It showed that older Americans, 64% of older Americans are more likely to see Russia as a military danger. Only 51% of younger Americans. So I think maybe it's nostalgia for the Cold War, maybe it's memories.
Well, let's hope we can get that number way up with the young people that don't want to go to war and see no sense in it. I think one of our problems is that we creep into war. And it's not done by accident. Just recently, matter of fact, just yesterday, they had a vote on whether or not there was an amendment that our friends put up to say that at least, why don't we have a debate on whether we should give the president the authority to use military force in the war on ISIS? Mm-hmm. And it didn't pass. It came out pretty good. I was on a lot weaker vote than this, but the large majority of Republicans say, no, even Obama can do what he wants. Why should we have even a debate? The resolution didn't even say, well, let's give him the support, let's deny him the support, let's regulate what he's doing. It just said, why don't we talk about this? I think this is so sad.
It's interesting. I always feel a little nervous when they actually get a vote because, I think in this case it's very sure that it would go the wrong way and they would authorize it. So if they feel pretty confident they would authorize the war, yet they still don't want to be on record for it.
Yeah, but the vote, even though our side didn't win this vote, it was a pretty encouraging. What was the total vote on that? It was not too far split, and yet. Just remember back when our coalition with liberal, progressive Democrats and people like Walter Jones and others, we'd get votes. And sometimes we'd say, are we going to get 15? Yeah. Are we going to get 20 trying to slow up the slaughter going on in Iraq? But now I think the sentiment is growing. But I think the people unfortunately believe that sanctions are okay. So these same Europeans sort of didn't say much. At the beginning they did for economic reasons. Why are we taking on Russia over Ukraine? But I think people too often, in maybe Canada, United States, they get their opinions from, Fox and MSNBC, and they sort of preach this doctrine that we have this obligation to go and fight these wars. But it really doesn't solve the problem of what our country ought to do with NATO. I'm afraid NATO is going to be with us for a long time. I see it as only a tool for our propaganda. But quite frankly, I think Robert Taft was right way back in 1944.
Well, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, that NATO is building a huge new headquarters in Brussels. Right. And it's, of course, well over budget. I think it's $1 billion plus for this huge headquarters. So they're not going away anytime soon. They're probably expanding. It's such a huge boondoggle. The other thing that's interesting, though, in this Pew poll is that U.S. opinion of NATO has gone down since 2011. The favorable is now only 49% among Americans. It's down from 54% in 2011. And a percentage of Americans that view NATO unfavorably has risen to 31% from 21% in just 2010.
See, I think we're in a transition. I think attitudes are changing, and it's people's attitudes and ideas that really count. But the number wasn't tested, I don't believe, in this poll, but a lot more Americans don't believe the government. You know, I mean, they don't believe, commissions, investigations. They don't believe that. They're skeptical of government. But then at other times, they seem to blindly go along. And that at times is probably lack of leadership. You know, they hear all the propaganda from Washington and they hear it on the television and they go along. But in spite of all that, against all those odds, I think the internet is helping us, to alert people to be really questioning what the government is doing. But I just think it's so sad that we're moving in a direction where they, are questioning the war at the same time. There's an amendment that sort of passed by most Americans about saying, why don't we rein this power in? I mean, this isn't even anywhere close to saying, we are real radicals. We're going to radicalize the system in Washington. We're going to make sure that everybody obeys the Constitution when we go to war. We're nowhere close to that.
Exactly. We were talking about this before the show started. What's interesting, it probably shouldn't be a surprise, but among NATO countries, the population that's the least enthusiastic to go to war with Russia is Germany. And even though Angela Merkel is really proving herself a lapdog to Washington, the German people are not with her. Only 38% of German people would agree to go to war with Russia, even if Russia was attacking. And the reason why, well, they've been there twice, and they've done that, at least twice in the last century.
One thing that I think they fail to understand is that putting tough sanctions on a country, I consider an act of war, and I think they should be more cautious. So let's do sanctions, and we won't have to go and fight a war. But there was another figure that I thought was interesting about how militant the Russians are now. They're ready to come. The Russians are coming, and we have to stop them. And where are we going to do this? And here the people closest to them aren't too worried about it. But even if you look at the military expenditures, and I think, who's spending the most? Well, we're spending more than twice as much as the next four countries put together. And of course, China is in there, but Russia is the fourth. But Russia, there's a country called Saudi Arabia spends more money, or subsidizes our military and industrial complex. More money is spent there than it is in all of Russia, and yet people want to be nearly hysterical about the need to go to war. And somebody was pulling a stunt the other day of trying to get, beachgoers to sign a petition to say, let's have an initial strike on it. I mean, a very unscientific poll. But Obama wants to have an initial strike of a nuclear weapon, and they could get people to sign these things. So that is our job, and that's been your job at the Institute, is try to get people information to think about this differently. And we need it. The world needs it, certainly.
About Saudi Arabia that I wonder about, they buy tons of our weapons, as you pointed out a minute ago. It was just last month that Obama said, we're ready to use military force to protect Saudi Arabia. It almost sounds like a quid pro quo, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that sadly is another place where we are at war. We're participating, and civil war is going on, but we don't want to go over the list where we are, but we are very, very much engaged. It's perpetual war for perpetual peace, because we're the good guys and we're after the evildoers, and we're an exceptional nation. And it puts us in a tough spot, because there's so much greatness that has been associated with America and the advancement of the cause of liberty. But I can't argue that the advancement for the cause of liberty has been very good in the last 100 years. But these people that argue the case that because of our greatness and we protect liberty, and then, and there's reasons you can make the case for the evildoers on ISIS, but think of who does more beheadings than ISIS. It happens to be Saudi Arabia. So this is the problem. And this also opens up the door for advancing our cause and our foreign policy, which is the traditional American foreign policy. It's what the founders advised. They've been pretty careless over the years, but that obviously is that we have non-intervention.
I think we'd agree with the neocons that, believe it or not, that our foreign policy isn't working. We agree. But our solution is let's do something different. Theirs is let's do more of the same. Which one sounds insane?
You know, the Keynesian economists are the same way too. You know, they manage an economy, they manipulate the economy with the Federal Reserve, manipulating interest rates for 100 years, and finally we get recession after recession and depression, and now we're in stagnation. And so if you ask Paul Krugman what to do, well, you guys worry too much about debt. Debt is not a problem. Debt is money. You know, you just take that and put it in the bank, and it's an asset, and that is money. So what do they advertise? Spend more money, run up more debt, have the Fed do more regulations, and on and on. Same way in foreign policy. Unintended consequences of either foreign intervention or domestic economic intervention causes many more problems, which prompts interventionists to just do more intervention, and we have to break the cycle. And I believe the breaking up of this cycle is going to come, but under rather precarious conditions, because most of this will stop when the money stops in places like we've seen it, like when the money stops in Detroit, what happened. But we better be prepared for when the money stops working for this whole country, which will involve the whole world and be a real threat to all of us. Threat not to our economic well-being, but it's going to be a threat to our liberties as well. I want to thank everybody today for tuning in to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.